I slammed the doorbell so hard my knuckles buzzed, watching the ring feed like a jury waiting to decide guilt or mercy. And there she was, stumbling up our front steps with a bottle swinging from her hand and screaming my name like I could fix whatever she'd broken. I thought my blood would boil right out of me. I watched her, this woman I'd known my whole life, reduced to that mess, and every instinct I had screamed at me to keep the door locked and the baby sealed away from her. The camera caught everything, the swaying, the slurred words, the way she looked at the house like she belonged there when she'd been banned from it for months. And it felt like a punch to the gut that I'd even let her back within a 10-mile radius. She pounded on the door with those useless, pleading gestures, and I could hear the whining in her voice. Please, please, man, you have to stop, you have to listen to me, like she thought begging would erase what she did. I didn't open the door. Not that night, not ever again, without conditions that were written down, witnessed, and legally enforced. I held the phone up and watched the live feed with my heart jackhammering against my ribs, convinced every second that the door might finally give or she might find a way to climb a fence and get inside. My hands shook not because I was afraid of her, though I was, but because I was terrified for my son and what irrational people can do when alcohol chains them. She shouted our mother's name too, a cheap ploy to tug at family loyalty, and it worked on others the way a con works, quickly and messily. I knew how the narrative would spread through relatives who hated conflict more than they loved truth. They'd see the photo of her with flowers, the staged teary caption, and they'd decide she was the victim. Some people always side with the wounded animal, even when that animal has bitten a child. It's ugly but true, and that truth saves me from pretending to be kind when kindness would be dangerous. I remember the nausea from before when my son's little chest rose and fell under ER lights, and that memory was a steel rod in my spine that didn't bend when she wailed at the camera that night. I'm sorry, man, I'm sorry, please let me see him, she kept saying, like apologies count for chemical changes in a tiny body. I answered once, cold and short, because words were the only weapons I had then. You don't get to apologize your way back into a nursery. She flicked the bottle like a prop, then tried to object, then started again to cry loud and theatrical. Some people perform sorrow to get what they want. I had learned to watch for the script. Neighbors peered through curtains as if this were soap opera material they were owed. A woman across the street came out with a cardigan wrapped around her shoulders and a look that asked for explanation, but I refused to narrate our trauma for casual consumption. Not now, not ever without a lawyer present. My marriage had taught me how to stand solid where I once would have crumbled. My husband's hand on my back that night was a quiet, iron anchor, reminding me we were protecting our son from a monster that wore family faces sometimes. She tried to kiss the door, like touching our threshold would conjure forgiveness, and it made me sick enough to step back from the camera. I thought about people who insist blood is thicker than a broken brain, about parents who circle the wagons around the selfish child and call it loyalty. My parents' reluctance to fully condemn her already stung. They made excuses, whispered about young mistakes and bad phases, and that hesitation had almost killed our boy once. There's a cruelty in protecting the perpetrator because you can't name them. That cruelty feels like betrayal when your child is sleeping a few rooms away. I called the detective friend Jordan because this wasn't a family argument I could smooth over with a casserole. Jordan answered in 2 rings, voice low, practical. Do not let her in. Get video, get witnesses, and call if she crosses the line. He heard the tremor in my voice and didn't pity me. He offered tactics instead of comfort. That night I followed every one of his instructions, not out of righteousness, but out of a fierce paternal calculation. Better to be brutal now than to apologize in a hospital hallway later. I taped the ring video to 2 cloud accounts, texted it to our lawyer, and made sure every light in the house blinked alive so no one could claim they just wanted to drop off flowers. She left eventually, pulling away on the porch like a child denied candy, but the way she looked back at me through the camera, red-eyed, defiant, like she was already plotting, told me this wasn't the end. It never is when alcohol wraps its fingers around someone's brain. I sat down on the stoop until dawn, watching the feed like it was a sleeping infant, knowing that my heart would never trust her again unless her hands were clean under court orders and her breath stayed clear of liquor for good. I know people will call me harsh, say I overreacted, but I would rather be judged by a room than bury my son because someone else couldn't stop drinking. Her drinking started like a bad habit that got louder every year, an annoyance at family dinners that became a threat crawling toward us. I remember the first time she showed up tipsy and laughed it off as funny, and how I rolled my eyes and let it go because who wants to be the moral police at a birthday? But habits harden into patterns, and patterns become character. By 23, she was drinking more. By 24, it felt like she was trying to drown herself on purpose. And by then, her drinking was a weapon she aimed at people she thought she could manipulate. I didn't notice how sharp she'd become until the tricks started. She'd spike my soda when we were teenagers and film my reaction like it was content, not cruelty. I coughed and laughed then, humiliated, thinking she was trying to make memories. That changed the night she poured liquor into my glass on her birthday, filmed me choking on the taste, and played it back for everyone to laugh. I told her then, straight and flat, "Don't ever get me drunk again," and I meant it like a promise to myself. I was man enough to put down a boundary. That boundary felt like the only true thing I had left with her. When she sabotaged me at her anniversary party, slipping shots into my drink until the world spun, something inside me snapped in a way that wasn't about pride or embarrassment. I woke up in a stranger's car with 2 texts from her that said, "See, I told you we'd have fun," and I realized she was not harmless. That morning, I made the decision to cut her off. I told her I wanted nothing to do with someone who used liquor as a trick and a trap. I deleted her number, told my parents not to give her my address, and I thought that would be the end of it. I thought cutting the cord would make our house safe again. Life moves on in weird ways. I fell in love, got engaged, married a person who could hold space for my trauma without trying to fix it with optimism, and when I found out we were pregnant, my world rewired itself into a single protective compass. I knew what kind of parent I wanted to be, and I knew what kind of danger I would not let into my child's life. Then she reached out of the blue, messages that read like a script for forgiveness, apologies that smelled like desperation, promises and pleas that family matters. I stared at the screen for hours, feeling every old wound flare like someone had dumped salt over it. I told myself I could be reasonable. I wanted to believe in second chances if they were real and documented. I answered her short, cautious messages and agreed, carefully, to let her back into a tiny corner of my life if she could follow one iron rule. I typed it out, slow and deliberate, because words matter when you're dealing with someone who lies like it's breathing. Never be around my baby while you are intoxicated. I insisted on clarity. No alcohol when visiting, no pressuring me or my husband, no unannounced appearances. I wanted it all on paper and evidence, because memory is slippery and promises are not worth the thickness of a rotten wristband. She complied at first like she was auditioning to be trustworthy. I set boundaries and watched her from a distance. She came to a baby shower sober, hugged my wife with tears that looked real, and sat in the corner like she was a guest who knew the rules. Those weeks of quiet felt like walking on glass, every footstep careful and counting. We had cameras, witnesses, and an agreed plan. If there was even a whisper of alcohol, she leaves. It felt absurd that trust had to be enforced like a curfew, but that's what protection looks like when you've been betrayed by blood. Even in those calmer moments, I kept an inner list of red flags. Her excuses, the ways she minimized what she'd done, the way she learned manipulative phrases to pull at the heartstrings. I told myself I would watch for those things and I'd act fast. I would not hand my son into anyone's care until their hands were proven steady, sober, and accountable. I repeatedly told myself out loud and in the quiet that love doesn't mean permission to harm. That belief hardened into a daily practice of documentation and caution, because you don't get to change the rules after the crisis. You have to keep them ironclad. For a while she played the part like a good actor. Polite, careful, sober enough when I was in the room, smiling like she'd rehearsed the right lines for family. I watched her every visit with a tiny, furious checklist in my head: breath smell, steady hands, steady eyes, and I made my husband stand by me like a witness to history, because history had already taught me that trust needs witnesses. It felt ridiculous to write rules for family like a contract, but when your child's safety is the price of a mistake, you stop being sentimental. That night started like the others, with small talk and careful hugs that felt more like minefields than comfort. She arrived later than she said she would, and her bag rattled in a way that made my skin crawl, but she waved it off with a laugh. "Just 2 bottles for later," she said, and I smiled like the idiot who wants to believe someone he loves. She set them down in the living room as if they were harmless props, and she kept lifting her glass like anyone else at a party. I watched the tilt of her wrist and felt every old alarm bell clang louder. As hours passed, her laughs turned thinner and her sentences looped. She slurred a little, then more, and the bottle that had sat on the coffee table disappeared faster than I expected. My husband shot me that look between us, the one that says we need to act, and I told myself I would not be the guy who made a scene for pride's sake. "Hey, remember the rule, okay?" I said softly, careful not to sound like a prison guard because anger tends to push people deeper into denial. She smiled like she understood, but her eyes were already glassy. Then she said she needed the bathroom and walked upstairs like she'd been granted a small mercy. I gave her the space because privacy felt like a concession I could afford, and I assumed she'd do the decent thing. A minute turned into 2, then 5, and an uncomfortable silence grew like mold. I followed up, not because I wanted confrontation, but because adrenaline makes you move without thought. "You okay up there?" I called, my voice steady enough for the camera to catch later if needed. No answer came back, only the soft thud of a television on in the background. When I went upstairs to check, I found the bathroom empty and the hallway quiet, and then I heard a tiny noise from the bedroom that made something drop inside my chest. I pushed the door open and there she was, wasted, disheveled, eyes too wide for her face, holding my son like she'd plucked him off a shelf. He was wrapped in a blanket, small and trusting, and his tiny head bobbed against her shoulder like he belonged there. For the split second before panic hit, I thought my heart would stop. She tried to hand him back to me as if handing over an object, and her fingers slipped. I watched the world slow, my hand reached, missed, and my son hit the floor. Time split into 1,000 frames, the blanket folding, my knees taking weight, my wife's scream tearing the air. He cried, a sharp, frightened sound that punched my gut, and in that second I was a man who had to move faster than fear. I grabbed him, checked for broken bones as if I could tell by the way he squirmed, and felt for anything wrong. He was screaming, but breathing. For that heartbeat, I held the terrible hope that the fall had been small enough to be only scary, not deadly. We put him in the car and called a cab for my sister like we were ejecting a live wire from the house. She kept muttering apologies like they were currency she could spend to buy back conscience. We sent her home with a cab receipt clutched by our neighbor and told her not to come back. I thought then so arrogantly and stupidly that this was the full stop, a horror punctuated and closed, because the sight of her holding him, the way her hands trembled, would be enough to keep her away. It was, later, in the cold, fluorescent light of the emergency room, we learned she had given him the rest of that bottle, the wine she'd tucked and sipped and thought no one would know. The nurse's face went hard when she said it, like someone naming a crime out loud. We held our son as monitors beeped and the world narrowed down to a single bright problem: alcohol in his tiny system. I felt rage, pure and elemental, and beneath it a deeper, darker terror, the knowledge that family can hurt you the worst, and that our worst betrayal came with the softest voice asking for forgiveness. The ER was bright and loud and wrong, like someone had ripped the world open and shoved machines inside, and I felt my knees go soft while nurses moved like practice storm crews around my son, tapping at screens and drawing blood with calm hands that did not fool the fear in my chest. I felt like a cheap character in a terrible play, watching professionals give orders and shove lines of tech and fluid into a tiny body while my husband David and I clung to each other like an island in an ocean of fluorescent light. I kept saying his name and touching his fingers because that was all I could do that felt useful, all I could do that made me feel like a man instead of a frightened parent. They ran tests fast, blood work, breath checks, monitors, and every beep was a verdict that could swing from mercy to catastrophe in an instant. Nurses told us not to read too much into the first readings, then updated us, then stepped back with faces I couldn't read. A social worker came in asking calm, careful questions that sounded to me more like cross-examination than compassion. It felt like being in a courtroom where the accused was both parent and victim, where every answer I gave might be twisted into negligence by someone reading their script. The child welfare investigator asked everything. When was she allowed to visit? Had there been threats? Had we noticed any pattern? I answered with documented facts, with the dry, legal language of someone protecting a child, because there was no room that night for family feelings. Megan vanished like steam. Calls went straight to voicemail, texts sat read or unread, voicemails stacked up where explanations should have been. Her silence was a confession that shouted louder than any apology could. I replayed our last scenes together in my head, the way she'd held my son, the way she'd lied to me before, and that silence felt like proof she knew the gravity of what she'd done. I wanted her in the room to answer questions, to watch our child hooked up to monitors, to see the consequence of one drunken decision, but she wasn't there. Instead, I had the sterile glare of hospital lights and the steady voice of professionals telling us how to brace for outcomes. When the pediatrician finally spoke to us later that day, everything narrowed. The word alcohol poisoning landed like a stone and made ripples I could feel in my bones. They said there were no immediate visible permanent damages, which felt like an unbearable relief and a thin hope to cling to, but the doctors warned me in the same breath about possible developmental risks that might appear later: learning delays, behavioral issues, impacts you can't always predict. Hearing the clinical list of potential futures for my son felt like being handed a bad set of lottery numbers you are forced to watch for decades. I nodded too quickly through the medical jargon, felt the edges of calm shred, then rebuild with a new, cold purpose: do everything to protect him from further harm. When the nurses finally stepped back and let us leave the ER, I was raw and trembling and furious in a way I had not allowed myself to be before. I drove to Megan's apartment like I'd been shot out of a cannon, not thinking about process or consequences, but about standing in front of the person who had put my child in a hospital bed and demanding answers. Her building smelled like old takeout and cheap perfume. People in the hallway pretended not to see me because that's what neighborhoods full of secrets do when they don't want to be involved. I knocked on doors, asked neighbors, and tried to find someone who would be honest. Her boyfriend opened the door like he expected my arrival, and his face went flat when he realized why I was there. He told me he didn't know, that he never saw her drink like that he would have stopped her if he had known she was around my child. His words slid across me like oil. Part of me wanted to believe him because people are capable of blind loyalty to their comfortable truths, but another part of me had seen the video evidence, the bottle in her hand, the pattern of deceit. I left him the way you leave a bad answer you don't want to argue with, documented, recorded, and unimpressed. I called a taxi for Megan that night because I wasn't about to let my rage make me do something I'd regret legally. I made sure there was a record of her leaving, that someone saw her go, that she could not claim she'd remained in any state of ignorance about what had happened. That night, driving home with my son secure and bundled and sleeping but still fragile, I made a vow I planned to keep with the whole weight of my being. Megan would never see our family again unless every court, every therapist, and every test proved she could be trusted around him. No more backdoor reconciliations, no soft excuses, no family pressure to forgive. I felt something like grief for the sister I used to have and something like cold resolve for the father I needed to be. People will call me harsh, they will call me unforgiving, I don't care. I'd rather be unforgiving than bury a child for the sake of keeping a family portrait pretty. She didn't go quiet and clean up her mess. She went public and turned herself into a martyr in a drunk little video that exploded through family group chats and feeds, painting her as the wounded aunt instead of the woman who'd poisoned my baby. I watched that video like it was a slow, cruel film where the villain rewrites the script and everyone applauds. She slurred her version, tears and bluster, and people who didn't know the facts took it as gospel. I felt sick watching her play the victim, while my son had been in an ER bed because of her choices. Family members started circling like supporters at a rally, sending messages that were sneaky and sweet and full of assumptions. Maybe you're being too harsh, some said. She's really hurting. Others asked for context and then vanished when I offered evidence. The split in the family cut deep because some people prefer a tidy, comforting story over a messy truth that forces them to choose sides. I found myself answering more texts than I wanted, sending screenshots and tagged files to people who still wanted to believe the easier story. It was exhausting to fight for reality while also fighting to keep my home safe and sane. Then she produced a fake rehab letter like someone handing out props at a play. It was polite, stamped, and designed to make it look like she'd enrolled in treatment. She used it to demand visitation rights, to argue that she was receiving help and therefore her access should be restored. The audacity made my blood run cold. I knew enough about paperwork to spot the holes, the odd formatting, and the lack of contact information that would usually be on a real document. I saved a copy, of course, because if you're going to fight lies, you need receipts. That fake letter became another piece in our file, dishonest, deliberate, and dangerous because it could influence people who didn't look closely. Jordan, the detective friend, told us exactly what we needed to do. Judges like patterns and proof, not drama and social media noise. He said to document everything and to make the pattern so ugly and clear that no judge could ignore it. Jordan's voice was plain and practical, and he made us feel less alone. We made a system that night: hospital reports, screenshots of her posts, the fake rehab paperwork, voicemails, taxi receipts, witness statements, all filed into one shared document and a dedicated email just for this case. That email became our ledger. If something new happened, we dropped it there, time-stamped and organized. It felt bureaucratic and cold, but when you're defending a child, you learn to love the coldness of hard facts. We installed cameras inside and out because the house had to be a fortress. Lights, motion sensors, 2 cloud backups, everything was turned into evidence. The cameras were awkward at first, like a weird new family member always watching, but they became a comfort. When you've seen the worst behaved like a family member, you don't ask permission for protection. We blocked her from our accounts, shut down any direct lines of contact, and changed routines so she couldn't predict our days. Privacy felt like a weapon and like a warm blanket at once. That wasn't enough for her. She escalated. When you try to box someone in with evidence and boundaries, some people push harder, not back. She showed up at our house drunk in the dark with flowers and a clumsy note that smelled like performance rather than remorse. She tried to access medical records by calling clinics and asking about appointments under false pretenses. She messaged our intended daycare with vague, probing comments that felt like testing to see if walls had weak points. Each small intrusion was a new line in our documentation email, another photo in our folder, another reason Jordan said we needed legal steps. She even had our parents shelter her for weeks quietly, like people covering for a problem rather than confronting it. That betrayal hurt in a way I didn't expect. It was a private kind of heartbreak that made family dinners into minefields. Then she used that shelter to approach us again, always with the same syrupy, rehearsed voice, always with a story that expected forgiveness as payment for her return. I refused. Every escalation, every new scheme, every attempt to twist sympathy in her favor only made my resolve harder. Protecting my son meant I was going to be unpopular and labeled cruel sometimes, and so be it. I would rather be cruel in people's mouths than dead in a hospital hallway. She started showing up like a bad dream you can't wake from, late at night on our porch with flowers and a teddy bear, reeking of wine and playing the part of the repentant aunt while my baby slept a few rooms away. I watched the ring feed more than I slept those nights, counting her steps, watching her fumble with the doorknob like she wanted a way in and also wanted to be seen. I'd lock the door and stand behind it with my phone in my hand, feeling equal parts fury and a sick, heavy fear that she might try to snatch something she had no right to touch again. She called the pediatrician and pretended to be concerned while fishing for my son's records, like some script she'd found in a tabloid. "I just want to know he's okay," she said into the phone when the nurse asked who she was. Her voice sounded soft and panicked and totally false. I sat there hearing the recording and knowing she had no right to that information. It made my blood run cold thinking about someone who'd given alcohol to an infant trying to find out when he had his next checkup. Then she started showing up at the daycare we planned to use, asking about enrolling her nephew in a way that felt like premeditation. She smiled and said she was worried as an aunt, but the way she took in the layout and noted the staff names felt like reconnaissance. Our nanny called me one afternoon in a shaky voice to say someone had been following her route into work, watching where she parked and what time she came. That call felt like a new kind of terror because it proved she was thinking about access and timing, and that she was not going to leave until our routine had been mapped. One morning I walked into Jackson's nursery and found a wine-stained gift basket on the changing table like a mockery of everything we stood for. The basket smelled of alcohol and cheap flowers, and part of me wanted to throw up. My wife backed away and made a choking sound that wasn't just disgust. It was the sound of someone who knew the violence of proximity. I took photos, saved every detail, and called the police until my voice was hoarse. They came, took a report, and added everything to a file that already felt heavy with proof. But police told us the same thing in different words. Until she crossed clearly defined legal lines again, options were limited. It ripped me open to learn my parents had been hiding her, that they'd taken her in and let her be near our lives like a soft threat. They arranged a surprise family visit so she could be around Jackson without us expecting her, like they thought that would be reconciliation. I remember my stomach dropping when I realized what they'd done. It felt like betrayal sewn into the fabric of the home. I met them in the driveway and my voice hitched when I asked why. "She needed a place," my father said, eyes cast down, and the look on my mother's face was full of excuses that sounded like strings pulled to avoid conflict. I told them I couldn't trust them to protect my son if they were sheltering the person who nearly killed him. The police logged every incident, every call, and the file grew thick with timestamps and statements. Still, the law moves slow, especially when the offender is family and tries to hide misdeeds behind performative apologies. Officers told me they could issue warnings, and if she returned, they could escalate. But until repeated violations stacked up into undeniable patterns, we were living on temporary protections and the shaky promise of patrols. I felt like we were waiting on a cliff edge for something to break wrong again. So we doubled down on precautions. I changed locks, updated daycare permissions, and made sure our nanny had a list of people allowed near our son with photos and firm instructions. We put motion sensors in the yard and told neighbors to call if they saw her car. Every small step felt both necessary and humiliating, like I'd turned my life into a security operation where I was both guard and prisoner. But I would have lived like that forever if it meant keeping Jackson safe. Trust had been broken so thoroughly that the only thing left to do was replace faith with facts and love with ironclad rules that even family could not bend. That secret betrayal broke me in a way I didn't know my heart could break. The idea that my parents would shelter the woman who almost killed my child stripped something loose inside me, and I realized some family ties are poison dressed as loyalty. I told them to stay away from our son, cut contact cold and final, and felt both grief and relief like two heavy stones in my chest. It's funny how betrayal from the people who raised you feels worse than any stranger's cruelty. At least strangers have no claim. My parents had one, and they chose her over our safety. We doubled down on security like a city under siege, locking doors, changing routines, and turning our lives into a set of strict protocols that read like war orders. The paranoia was exhausting but practical. Cameras with night vision, motion detectors, backup cloud storage, and a list of emergency contacts laminated and taped to the fridge. David's parents offered their gated house while things calmed, and we moved there temporarily because a locked gate with controlled access suddenly felt like the only honest kindness left in the world. We slept with monitors and charged phones and a legal folder within arm's reach. She didn't give up. The stalking ramped up into a pattern that made you believe desperation can be a weapon. Unknown numbers flooded our phones with calls and texts, each message a different tone trying to pry at any soft spot. She called relatives who hadn't been blocked and asked leading questions about our routines like she was mapping our days. Every new contact she manufactured was a small invasion that added up to a loud, steady pressure. I watched the screen and wondered how someone could be so relentless when what they'd done was so clear. Then came the night the security footage caught her trying to scale the fence at David's parents' place, and the sight of her silhouetted against the motion lights felt like a movie I never wanted to be in. She moved like someone who'd rehearsed the scene, shoes scraping the wood, hands reaching for the top rail as if the yard were a stage she could cross into. That footage was ugly and undeniable. There's a cold clarity to a clip that shows intent in motion. I felt my stomach drop when I watched it, like seeing evidence in a courtroom where guilt is no longer a rumor but a fact. We gave everything to Jordan and to the police: timestamps, messages, witness statements, and the fence footage that made the pattern obvious. With that collection, a judge issued a temporary restraining order to keep her away from our address, our workplaces, and our son. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a small legal shield between us and her chaos, like law had put up a strong, clear boundary I could point to with authority. It felt less like victory and more like survival dressed as paperwork. Of course she violated the order. The anger some people wear when they think they own forgiveness is loud and dangerous, and she ignored the court line like it was a suggestion rather than a command. She called from burner phones, showed up at the perimeter, and even left things she thought would embarrass us in public places. Every time she crossed that line, we added a new report to the file. Each violation felt like a small erosion of calm. Every fresh call made me tighten my jaw and my routine a little more. Eventually, the pattern and the repeated violations pushed the system to act. The police arrested her for violating the restraining order, and court processes started moving with a force I'd hoped for earlier. She was evaluated, and those evaluations revealed issues that were deeper than just addiction, personality problems, and instability that explained some behavior but did not excuse it. The court ordered treatment and monitoring, conditions that sounded good on paper and gave me a cautious relief because it meant she couldn't simply vanish and resume stalking without consequences. Sitting through the hearings, signing the affidavits, and watching her enter a program with compliance checks felt like watching someone I used to love become a case file. I wanted anger to be enough, but anger isn't a legal strategy. So we did the only responsible thing: collect facts, show patterns, and force the system to move when boundaries were crossed. The judge's orders gave us breathing room, but they didn't undo what had happened. They only made it harder for her to try again. I don't know if the court can change her, but at least for now, the law keeps my son farther from danger than family loyalty ever did. I watched her walk into the room at a family picnic and my stomach turned, because years had taught me how fragile trust is and how easy it is to fake a smile when you're still dangerous. She'd come to most events sober, checked in with our court-appointed monitor, and sat in the back like someone on probation, and that was the point. I told myself and everyone who would listen that safety mattered more than optics. I kept saying the word boundary until it felt like armor. Recovery was never a neat line. It was jagged, full of setbacks and small, stubborn victories, and I had to learn to read both with a skeptical eye. There were months she showed up to therapy notes and clean tests, and months where she slipped in tone or disappeared for days. The court orders and the therapists kept records like a ledger that couldn't be argued away. I learned to trust paperwork when people's words had already proved cheap. Jordan had been right. Judges look for patterns, and patterns told us whether she was moving toward real change. We wrote rules that felt both harsh and necessary. No unsupervised contact with Jackson ever, no gifts without prior approval, and all family sessions supervised until a long run of sobriety and stability was documented. Those rules felt clinical and heartless to some, and to a point I didn't care what people thought. My job was to keep my child safe, not to make everyone feel comfortable. The conditions were not punishment for her alone. They were shields for us, constructed with legal steel and therapist tape. Her compliance over months surprised me in parts and angered me in others. She showed up for urine tests, signed into counseling, and participated in group therapy where she learned to name the things she'd been doing to cope. Those sessions were messy. She cried, she blamed, she finally started to own the awful parts, but owning something in a room full of strangers is a radical start. Her therapist sent notes, treatment centers faxed documents, and slowly the list of violations thinned. I documented everything in that painstaking, bureaucratic way we'd built together. Documentation became my new religion because it saved us from being gaslit by family myth. A couple years later, she began working as an addiction counselor herself, which felt like a provocation and a possibility all at once. I watched the job title on her social media profile and felt things churn, part pride, part skepticism, and a fixed strand of fear. It's easy to use past pain as currency when you haven't fully paid for the harm you caused. But I also watched the hours she logged, the supervision notes, the volunteer work and license renewals, and the slow accumulation of evidence that she was doing something different with her life. That change didn't erase what happened. It made me wonder whether there's room for practical redemption in a world that mostly rewards spectacle. We allowed supervised sober visits at family events after strict checks. She met Jackson in crowded rooms with monitors present and my wife or me at arm's length watching like hawks. Every interaction was recorded, every breath measured in the silence that follows trauma. Some relatives came back into the fold, but many did not. The family split wasn't healed by therapy notes, it was rearranged by consequences and by who chose to protect the child. I stayed in therapy long after the papers and the court orders were signed. Anxiety and hypervigilance are habits that don't dissolve simply because the law says so. I worked on being present with Jackson instead of always calculating risk like a weather forecast. My therapist taught me to name fear and then set it down slowly like an angry dog on a leash. I'm still learning that balance, to be watchful without teaching my child to live inside locks and cameras as if that's normal. Security stayed tight, updated cameras, restricted access to our child's records, and a rotating list of authorized visitors that our nanny carried at every shift. We made our lives inconvenient on purpose because safety should cost something. I said things people called harsh, like cutting off my parents, insisting on written rules, and never trusting forgiveness that smelled like convenience, but I stand by them. If protecting your child looks cruel to someone else, let them sit with that discomfort. I don't know if she'll ever fully atone. Some things don't have a ledger that balances, and apologies don't undo edges in a child's developing brain or the first terrifying ambulance ride. But I will say this plainly, I will never risk my child for the comfort of a family photo or the appeasement of relatives who can't face the truth. Our relationship now is cautious, monitored, and defined above all by Jackson's safety. I'm not a monster for that. I'm a man who learned the hard lesson that love sometimes means saying no forever.